I'm T. Jefferson Parker, and this is the story behind my stories.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
T. Jefferson Parker.
Find all of the archives of the show over at hankgarner.com. There are links in the right-hand sidebar where you can subscribe to the show on any platform that you listen to podcasts on. hankgarner.com, where you can listen on the site or subscribe everywhere. Today's show is brought to you by Grammarly, an intelligent writing app. Download Grammarly's browser extension and create a free Grammarly account at www.getgrammarly.com/Hank. That's www.getgrammarly.com/Hank. Grammarly is an excellent tool that will help you get your document that you're working on in shape before sending it off to your editor for that final pass. If you need that first look, Grammarly is the place to go. Also, for all of your correspondence on the web, Grammarly can help you make sure that you're saying what you intend to say. GetGrammarly.com/Hank. Also, thanks to my buddy C. Stephen Manley for sponsoring the show. His book, Master of Hounds, The Pickman Files, Book 1, is one of my favorite urban fantasy books that have come out this year. Chuck has been on the show before. He's one of the hosts of Keystroke Medium, one of my favorite group of guys, and one of my favorite podcasts out there. Master of Hounds, The Pickman Files, Book 1. Clint Mercer is about to get a crash course in magic. I love this book. I know you will too. Pick up Master of Hounds today. There's a link to it in the show notes. We'll talk more about it as the month goes on. Now on to our author interview for today. Stay tuned after the show for an audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I am super excited to have T. Jefferson Parker on the show with me today. He has a brand new book called Swift Vengeance, and this is one of his best ever. Jeff has had a long and illustrious career writing mysteries and thrillers and some of the best books in the genre out there, and super excited to have you on the show today, Jeff. Welcome.
Nice to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Well, thank you. We have a lot to talk about, but before we get into everything, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Oh, that's a good one. That's a good one. You know, I grew up as a little kid sitting on Mom's lap. And she would read to me, you know, animal stories, of course, you know, Perry the squirrel and Vulcan the condor and Shag, Last of the Plains of Buffalo, and I just love those stories so much. And you know, zoom forward a few years into high school, I was in a rowdy class of mostly boys in a mythology and folklore class taught by Miss Page, and she was a smart, beautiful young woman, and we were a terrible class, and one day she became exasperated with us, and she claimed that we were incapable of learning, so she brought in a pasteboard box full of books from her garage, paperbacks that she'd read, and she ordered us to form a single file line, come up and close our eyes and pick one out and take it back to our desk and read it. And I did that, and I closed my eyes, and I came up with a copy, old tattered copy, paperback copy of Joseph Heller's Catch-22. Oh. And I read that book, and I'm 15, right? I'm 14 years old, and I read that book, and it changed the way I looked at the world. It changed the way I looked at a story. I didn't think a book could ever be written that was as good as Shag, Last of the Plains, Buffalo, but guess what? Catch-22 was, and it made me really, really think for the first time, wow, if I could bring pleasure to readers like Joseph Heller brought pleasure to me, I would have to consider my time well spent. And I think that was kind of the beginning of the spark that said, well, gosh, maybe you could write someday.
That is so cool. And what a book to be the awakening book. That is,
I know,
such an amazing classic. Especially if you love the genre. I mean, that just goes to the heart of it. Did you? Was it one of these things where you say, if I could do this, but was there a doubt in you, or did you just think, you know what, I think this is something that I could do? That there's when you kind of realize that you have that writer gene, that I like to talk about, it kind of becomes inevitable. But was this something that you thought, I can do this, or this is just my ultimate goal to maybe get to this place one day?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it was kind of both. I felt that I had a reasonably good knack with words and writing. I was never writing, accomplished short stories in high school or anything like that. I barely wrote anything, but I felt that I might be able to find a voice in me that was passable. But I also knew that I was up against a real tall order. And long odds as far as, writing a book and getting it published and actually maybe even, making a career of it. For me, it was a real, I don't know. So when I sat down to write my first book, I was just out of college. I would say 22 years old maybe. And I wrote that book on just pure grit and determination and ambition. I was crazily ambitious when I was young, and I was energetic. And I wrote that book, a little short Bildungsroman about a young surfer growing up in Newport Beach. And I wrote that book, and I cast it into New York through an editor, a young editor I'd met. He was my age. I'd met him at a party of all things a few years earlier, and he was a hotshot editor at Delacorte, and he read that book. Manuscript was called The Bottom Line. And he called me a couple of weeks later. He goes, "Jeff, I read your book. I can't publish it. Nobody in New York cares about surfers growing up in Newport Beach, California." Second of all, you have some talent, I think, but more importantly, you have determination. You wrote the whole thing. You finished it. Not many people do that. You finished it and you sent it in. Good for you. Go to the New York Times book supplement, look at the bestseller list, read the synopses of what people are buying and what people are reading, read the little plot synopsis that each book has, and write me something more commercial. That's what he said. And that was the advice that he left me with. And so I went on to try something more commercial. And when I finally got Laguna Heat published, it was 6 years later, and I still didn't believe it was going to be published until I got a call from my agent saying that an editor at St. Martin's Press had accepted the manuscript. It was an eye opener for me.
So in this 6 year period between someone saying, Jeff, I think you've got something, and that Laguna Heat selling, what were you doing in that 6 years?
You know what I did? I'll tell you exactly, Hank. I had a job, a couple of jobs, newspaper reporter, and I began shortly after submitting that book to the young editor. I began writing a mystery set in Laguna Beach, because I thought that a mystery. I sort of liked reading them. I wasn't a real mystery fiend, but I read some, and I liked the kind of. I liked them. And so I thought mystery, at least it's a genre, and there's an audience for it. So I started writing that book, and it took me, and I wrote it 5 times in 5 years. And at the end of the first year, I had bad Hemingway, and at the end of the second year, I had bad Jim Harrison, and at the end of the third year, I had bad Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and at the end of the fourth year, I had bad Tom McGuane, and at the end of the fifth year, I had bad Raymond Chandler. And so I wrote 5 drafts in 5 years, and I threw them all away. And then I sat down, and I wrote one more draft with the deal. I made a deal with myself, and that was, don't try to write like your heroes, who all those people were. Don't write anything like them. If you see so much as a phrase that sounds like it might have been invented by one of those writers, get rid of it and write this next draft totally in your own voice. And you may not have a great book or even a decent book at the end of the year, but you will have a book that's yours. And so that's what I did. And I finished it, and I read it, and I finally realized, wow, there's my voice. That's me talking there, rather than trying to ape the writers that I loved as a young man, And I got the book was quickly accepted, and I was on my way.
Well, it's finding your own voice is critical. If you're going to stand out, you have to find your voice. You have to find what's going to resonate from deep inside you to deep inside a reader. That's absolutely crucial. But I love that you kind of wrote through your heroes in that process. Do you feel like, even though that was not your voice and not your final product, do you feel like writing through their voices or writing through their tropes or whatever it was that you were picking up from them, do you feel like that enhanced your ultimate writing skill by going through them?
I think so, and I do. I do think it allowed me to find my own voice, and copying them helped, and through is a great word. You're right. You're right through your heroes, I think, and when you have written through your heroes to the point where you're frustrated and you know that you're not in your own shoes yet, that's when you find your shoes, I think, and it's a necessary. It was a necessary exercise for me anyway. I'm not recommending anybody do what I did, but it worked for me, and you learn so much. I mean, I've always thought that the greatest single education thing that any writer can do is to read and to read up. Read the greats, read your heroes over and over again, whoever they might be, and through that, I think you learn who you are. And it takes a lot of writing. I think it took me a lot of writing to get like those 5 drafts. That was 2,500 pages I threw away en route to writing through those writers I just mentioned and others, of course, to the point where your voice comes to you and you finally are on the other side of imitation.
I've met a good many writers that on their way to writing fiction worked as reporters and journalists. Do you feel like that experience, going to visit crime scenes maybe and reporting on them, or just the mundane things of everyday life that then a journalist has to take and build a narrative around so that we can tell the story to the reading public? Even true stories need to be couched in narrative sometimes just to get the story across. Do you feel like that time that you spent working in the trenches there while you were working on your novel, do you think that was beneficial to you? Yeah. For all of those reasons, for sure, Hank. And I think also that the thing I encourage all writers to become journalists if they have the time. It's a great education. You get a crash course on the way the world really works, as opposed to the world of an English major, which is what I was. You're in the real world immediately. All these tides and currents and competing interests and personalities and traditions and business hitting journalism, and what do you do with the truth? It's all right there in front of you, and it teaches you it teaches you to write clearly, because you have to be simple and clear and chronological, and the W's, the where, what, when, blah blah, all that stuff. You have to get into your articles, and I think one of the most important things, besides introducing you to the world, that being a journalist does, is it teaches you to hit a deadline, which is really kind of useful. It teaches you to hit a deadline, so then when you go to write fiction, you go, like for me personally now, my goal is to write 5 pages a day. And if I get 5 pages a day, I am happy. Sometimes if I get 5 pages before noon, I'll quit and come back the next day and try to get 5. But I think part of the reason that I'm not afraid to sit down and write 5 pages is because I've made so many deadlines as a journalist. It's just the job. It's what you do, and it's good training for the writer. I've always thought that the fiction writers should write fast. I'm a fast writer. I like writing fast. I try to edit as I go, and I'm always willing to come back and rewrite, and I do rewrite. But I like the idea of looking at a novel as being an assignment of a reporter, and it's simply my job to write it up. It helps free the mind. Yeah. You're from Southern California, aren't you?
Yeah, I was born and raised here.
Yeah, you still live there?
Yeah, I'm in San Diego now. I was born in L.A., and I moved south to Orange County, 50 miles, and then I moved south to San Diego County, 50 more miles, just 18 years ago. So I've been here my whole life.
So you're just inching southward as you go.
Yeah, basically.
Your first books were set in California. Your newest book is set San Diego. Does Southern California, that experience, that setting, is that important to you as a writer? I guess what I'm asking is, does the place of Southern California become a character in your books, and is it easy to write there for you because you've been there your whole life?
Yeah, yes to all of those for sure. I feel vested here. I'm 4 years old now. I've been here my whole life, and so I'm vested here, and I'm part of its recent history, if you will, and I love writing about where I am. Again, I think that goes back to my reporter days of my beat was where I lived, and I look at on my fictional beat right now is kind of where I live because I'm familiar with it. Like you say, that makes it much easier in some ways. I'm still inspired by what I see around me. I love my little community that I live in, Fallbrook. Now I've written about Fallbrook the same way. My very first book, Laguna Heat, took place in Laguna Beach. So I like these little California settings, and each one's different, and I'm inspired by them, and I really like writing about where I am. Like if I were to move to outside of Denver, Colorado, and beautiful mountains where the fly fishing's good, and I decided I was going to go live there, I would be writing about that place in pretty short order because I love writing about where I am.
Right. What year did Laguna Heat publish?
1985.
Okay.
33 years ago.
So 33 years, and you have written, I've lost count how many books that you published.
24.
24.
Yeah.
In that 33 years and 24 books, how has the mystery genre, the thriller genre, changed in your eyes? And is it a challenge as a writer to keep coming up with stories that continue to grip readers, to keep those pages turning? And there's a lot of books out there in the genre, and the thrillers are uber hot right now. How do you keep people engaged when they've been exposed to so much in the genre?
Yeah, that's a really good question, a good observation. It's the genre is loaded, and it's always been a popular genre, and it seems to be
and for good reason.
So, yeah, there's a lot of good work. It's not to say the's too much and it's
exactly.
not any good. There's a lot, and it is good.
Right.
I think we're kind of in a golden age, for thriller writing right now. And mystery and thriller writing. How it's changed. I'm not enough of a scholar to really say, but the one thing that I think was seminal around in 1985 when Laguna Heat was published was that was the time that the serial killer became popular, and it kind of was the climax of being the Silence of the Lambs thing. I think the Thomas Harris books were probably the most influential mystery, crime, thrillers that I've ever experienced. I mean, there still is an industry, not even a cottage industry, but there still is an industry it's big in serial killer books. I mean, they're everywhere you look. And so that was a big change because those weren't around when I was cobbling together Laguna Heat. And maybe they were quietly around. I think Red Dragon was probably a really very seminal book. And so I think that changed our writing a lot and the habits of readers. And I mean, it's all the way to, television just stuffed with that kind of stuff now. So, I think that's a change, and I think that the writer's challenge, as you said, is how do you compete with all that and write stuff that's fresh and new and all, and I'm not really sure how you do it. I kind of write books that please me and that I think will please you, and I think will please my wife, and I think will please people who are like-minded like me, you know. But I'm kind of my first audience, and you know, I rarely find myself sitting there trying to think up my next book and going, well, you know, what's new and fresh and what haven't people heard before? And so I kind of don't think that way. And at the same time, I try to have, I think I have pretty good antenna for what's out there. And and when I sense that it's too much in the parlance, you know, like for instance, I would not write a serial killer book right now. I'm just not interested in that. And yet there are a lot of things that I might write, and if it sounds right and it feels right as I think about it, then I'll proceed and hope that I can drag my readers along with me, and they'll trust me enough to open the book and invest enough time to read a few pages, and then my duty as a craftsman is to rope them into that story using every trick that I know, every method. Every book has a different, every opening's different, you know. But every bit of skill that I've developed over the years, I'll bring to bear on those first 10 pages, with the idea that once you have read them, Hank, you're not going to be able to put the book down.
Right. Well, let's talk about the new book, Swift Vengeance, the brand new book. Tell me about Roland Ford, the hero of the book. He's a PI. There are a lot of things in this book that feel very familiar. They feel like I've read some of these stories in the headlines, it just what informed this book, and tell me about Roland. How did he come to you?
Yeah. You know, I started the series one book ago. This is the second book in the series, and so before I wrote the first one, I spent a goodly amount of time, you know, just kind of daydreaming about a character, a hero. I wanted to write a PI series. I knew that. I wanted to write a PI because I like them. I've always liked them, and I've never really done that before. So I was going to write a PI series, and my publisher was enthused about that idea. And so I spent some time trying to think of a hero who would be, you know, literally and figuratively broad-shouldered enough to carry the story forward from one book to the next, to the next, to the next. And so I came up with Roland Ford. I thought Roland was a good sort of a warrior's name, you know, Roland, Charlemagne's lieutenant. And I like the name Ford. It's an old family name. My father was Robert Ford, and my son is Thomas Ford. And so Roland Ford became his name. And more importantly, I tried to create a man, a PI, who was the kind of person that you would want if you were in a pinch. I wanted a capable one-man army. And so Roland has he's tall, he's physical, he's strong. He served as a Marine in 1st Fallujah. It's a family tradition in the Ford family for to serve. He does his time. He gets out. He becomes a boxer for a while. He boxes professionally one time. He loses the fight terribly. Realizes he's not cut out to be a boxer. Becomes a sheriff's department deputy, and then later gets mixed up in an officer shooting that goes very, very wrong, and quits the force and hangs his shingle, if you will, as a private investigator in a little town north of San Diego. So that's my hero, Roland, and so he's capable. I wanted him to be physically capable. You know, he's familiar with firearms. He's good with self-defense and, you know, getting out of physical jams. He's big enough to be imposing, and he's the guy that I wanted in my corner, I guess I'm trying to say, as a hero. He's also educated. He has a 4-year degree from a state college in history. He's read history. He likes reading history. He thinks about kind of big picture stuff. He's not just an action man at all. He's a thoughtful person, good judgment, does not suffer fools, you know, at all. He can be very abrupt and cutting, but he's also got a big heart, and he will always listen to your side of the story, if you will. So he's what I move forward with as a character, because he's got good background. He's a widower, and I explore that a little bit, death of his wife, and I can grow him book to book. You know, his backstory is interesting enough to bear scrutiny, I think. And then, of course, the other half, if not more, of every thriller is the now story. You know, the current day situation that he's in. And in this book, he is asked by an old friend to help protect her from. She's received a death threat that's very credible and very scary. And they both see that there's danger here. And Roland protects her. puts her up in a safe place, and then takes this handwritten death threat to the FBI in San Diego, to an FBI agent he's worked with before, a very tough agent named Joan Taucher, who is haunted by the ghosts of 9/11 and its connection to San Diego. And together and separately, they embark upon the journey of finding out the truth behind the man who wrote this letter, this death threat, and what he has got hatched. And of course, since it's a thriller, what he is planning is far more than just the murder of one woman, but a much larger evil he is planning.
Jeff, you write a lot of law enforcement officers in some of your previous series. There's always even if the main character is not a policeman or a sheriff's deputy, there's someone close by, and that a lot of your books kind of border on police procedural in a way, and we love those. But what did in making Roland a former officer who's now a private investigator who kind of gets to operate outside of that structure of what law enforcement can and cannot do, what as a writer did that do for you in developing Roland to have him there but outside of that system?
Yeah, you're right. It's such a different, the PI is so different than the officer in so many different ways. And, for me, I really liked the idea of an independent contractor. I really like that. A PI is in charge of his own destiny, if you will, much more than a police officer is, because police officers have to obey orders, and they have to operate within the defined, confines of the law. They're supposed to. Well, a private investigator doesn't have to do that necessarily. They can't break the law, but they might be able to stretch things or do things that an officer isn't able to do. And I also like, what I like even more than that is the fact that most PIs, Roland included, he can't call for backup. He's got a loose confederacy of friends back home who help him do certain things, but he can't call for backup ever. So when he gets in a jam, he's got to find his own way out of it. And I like that. There's something very individualistic and Western and sort of heroic about that in a way that a guy with a uniform and a badge can get on the horn and get backup within 5 minutes or something. Two completely different dramatic situations, and I love the freelance. I love the individual against the world much more than the bureaucrat against the world.
Yeah, absolutely. The new book is called Swift Vengeance. Jeff, this book is amazing. We're going to send everyone to come pick up a copy of it. If people are maybe not familiar with you and your work, but want to dig into your back catalog and learn more about you and your work and what you do, where could they connect with you at?
I got a pretty good website, lots of info on it and lots of links to, past books and catalog stuff and biography and all, tjeffersonparker.com. And, come on and check it out and see what you think. A lot of my books, even the books that are part of a series, I wrote to stand alone in the sense that, don't feel like you have to begin at the beginning of this series or the Charlie Hood series. You can pick a title and a cover that looks interesting or a review that sounds good to you and give it a try. You don't have to start at the beginning of my books. They all are discrete standalone novels in their own way.
The book is Swift Vengeance, T. Jefferson Parker. There's a link to it in the show notes. Jeff, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
Thank you, Hank. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
Mather steepled his hands. You asked to join us once? Hedwig leaned forward, eagerly. The appointed. Does that appeal? Yes. Do you even know what we do? My grandmother used to say that you control the world. That's not far off. But why? To what end? I don't know. Power? Pour me a bourbon. Mather reached into his briefcase and produced a file folder. I want to tell you one story. Have you ever heard of Centralia, Pennsylvania? No. He produced a photo for Hedwig's inspection. Spring of 1962. A pretty little town, wasn't it? Whitewash and ticky-tacky, pastel housewives and perfect lawns. A mining community, mostly. Coal. He turned over a second photo. A lovely young woman. There was a single witch in Centralia named Anna Lively. Anna had a green thumb. She could make her garden grow, whisper to a flower, and send it shooting from the ground like that. Just lovely. But she was discovered. That spring, a boy named Bobby Avery received a Bell & Howell Zoomatic movie camera for his 11th birthday. Bobby amused himself by filming his neighbors, sometimes without their knowledge, through windows and over garden fences. 12 seconds of film. Just a girl and her garden patch and one swiftly blooming rose. It killed the town. Bobby showed it to his friends. Children believe readily. Bobby was the first to die. Parents looked into it, watched the film themselves, and they began to die. Anna disappeared. Perhaps they attacked her. Perhaps she escaped. But even in her absence, knowledge of a true witch was running wild through the population, as if Anna had beckoned it herself to grow verdant and spread. The great curse had killed 64 Centralians by the 1st of June. The footage was offered to a national news organization. That was the precipice. It might have been shown in prime time, between Leave It to Beaver and My Three Sons. We came very close to another worldwide calamity, but we were fortunate. One of our own was in place at the network. He alerted his superiors, and they ended the situation. Do you know how? I'm afraid to ask. Mather laid down another photo. This is Centralia today. It was an aerial view of a forest. Endless trees and underbrush cut through by lanes of pavement. Just a maze of cracking asphalt, like the foundations of Sodom, ripped bare by the wrath of God. Only a cemetery remained, on a hill overlooking the former town. A white marble angel stood among the graves, grieving for the ruins below, like Lot's wife, turned to salt. You destroyed the whole town? Not I. This was well before my time, but yes. Just as you'd cauterize a wound to stop a patient from bleeding to death. We blamed it on an uncontrollable mine fire, deep below the earth. We actually set the coal burning, in case someone investigated. It burns today. Touch any of those streets and you'll find them hot, the asphalt melting, as if the town sat just above perdition. It's not something we're proud of, but it was necessary to save the world. Centralia, Pennsylvania, and everyone who'd seen that film had to be sacrificed. Mather collected the photos. So, that is why the appointed exist, and that is what we do. Still want to join?